Okay, well, thank you very much for inviting me. Um, you did say earlier that it was going to be an exciting topic, but I'll have to say this was based on my master's dissertation, so it was actually an academic study in the first instance. It's not quite as salacious as it could be. It's not like your prime time TV, really. Apologies for that. Um, it is about the public perceptions of prostitution in Victorian Lichfield, set over a very specific time because I was studying via the Lichfield Mercury, which some of you, I'm sure, will remember. Um, Lichfield's probably not the most obvious place to carry out a study of prostitution, especially in the Victorian era. But there's some very particular reasons that I had for choosing Lichfield, not least because I actually grew up in Kings Bromley, which is not very far away, and I lived in Burntwood for about 15 years or so as well. So I do have links to the area quite significantly. But before I go into sort of details about Lichfield itself, I thought it might be worth telling you a little bit about the history of prostitution itself as an occupation, if you like. Some context really about development of prostitution in Great Britain. It's often referred to as the oldest profession, as I'm sure you're aware, and the earliest reports of prostitution in this country date back to Roman times, so quite a significant time really, probably as long as we've got decent records going back. There aren't many surviving early records, you'll be unsurprised to learn, but by about 1058, cities like London were reporting on brothels being available in the cities. So in 1161, UK's first official red light district opened up. And this was actually guaranteed by King Henry II himself. He guaranteed the Bishop of Winchester the right to exploit the 18 brothels of Bankside in London's Southwark area for the next 400 years. So there you go, Crown sanctioned prostitution. It's not a new thing. Yeah, that's it. Henry II also introduced probably the first regulation that we know of about prostitution. He banned prostitution in other parts of Lichfield outside of this red light district, and he banned prostitutes from soliciting for trade. He also granted some rights to prostitutes for their protection. So brothel keepers weren't allowed to keep women in brothels against their will. They had limits on how much rent they could charge for the rooms. And they could not accept married women or nuns as prostitutes. So none of that, basically. Nor were they allowed to let anyone stay if she had what they described as the perilous infirmity of burning, by which they meant an STD, a sexually transmitted disease, obviously. So they were trying to keep things as clean as they could for the times. So clearly, if prostitutes have got rights, and prostitution is not illegal. It's sanctioned by the Crown and it's sanctioned by the bishops. And in fact, it never became illegal in this country. And we'll come back to that later. So what was happening in Lichfield at this time? Well, Lichfield was a religious centre, as I'm sure you're aware. The first cathedral was consecrated in 700 AD. And all this religious activity meant there were quite a few single men knocking about the place. Priests, monks, clerics, all of those kind of things. Obviously, a little bit of time on their hands, potentially. So coincidentally, there are a lot of medieval records of prostitution taking place around Lichfield. And again, some of you might be aware there's been a prostitution walk set in medieval times that somebody's been doing around Lichfield in the last 10 years or so. Records from the 15th century tell us that when clerics were found with women, the women were punished with fines and whippings. But not the clerics. No. So some specific examples include in 1466, a woman in Conduit Street apparently earned £3 by making herself available to the members of the household of the Duke of Clarence during his visit to the city. According to reports, they said she denied none who came to her and every night made so much noise that her neighbours could get no sleep. So it looks like the Duke of Clarence had quite a good time while he was here. In 1414, 4 brothel keepers from Beacon Street were brought to the Manor Court. And in 1466, a woman from Beacon Street, it's all going on around Beacon Street, she was accused of being with 2 women recently arrived from a London brothel. And in 1485, brothels were being recorded in Wade Street, Conduit Street, and on Green Hill. So Beacon Street, as I say, it was a thoroughfare on a major route, and it became notorious for its brothels, as Lichfield began to attract more visitors, and it became more strategically important. But by the Victorian era, things had changed for the UK, and also they'd changed quite a lot for Lichfield. So, by early Victorian times, prostitution in the UK was completely accepted as a normal thing. But that didn't mean it was treated as an acceptable thing. Although it was legal, it was something that was not expected to be seen in public, and decent people described this as a necessary evil. It was the only way to protect the purity of wives and mothers by allowing the husbands to satisfy their bestial urges outside of the marital bed. So basically, they didn't have to trouble their wives for anything that they wanted to do. Not a bad arrangement in some cases. But a growing number of voices were beginning to see prostitution as a social evil rather than a necessary one, and something that needed to be eradicated. So this is where the first lot of conflict arrived. Although the act of prostitution was seen to be necessary and so acceptable, the people that would perform that act weren't. They weren't acceptable, and they needed something to be done about them. Again, more context. Men, specifically upper class, and some middle class men were firmly in charge. Only those men who owned property were able to vote for much of the Victorian period. And as for women, women's roles were as wives and mothers only. Women of good standing were also allowed to do a little charitable work, as long as it wasn't too taxing for them. But lower class women, who had to work to feed their families, were outside the rules of polite society. And as for those lower class women who turned to prostitution to support themselves, well, the Victorian historian, that rhymes terribly, Victorian historian William Lecky said that the prostitute was scorned and insulted as the vilest of her sex, and doomed for the most part to disease and abject wretchedness and an early death. So he was quite clear where he stood on what these women were like. But even he still saw prostitutes ultimately as the most efficient guardians of virtue. This view, as I say, that prostitutes could satisfy a man's sexual need while guaranteeing the purity and respectability of single and married women who must remain chaste, was an important factor in the debates that came later. So where the roles of men and women were so clearly defined, a prostitute challenged and undermined those roles and the accepted standards of female behaviour. She, or sometimes he, there were male prostitutes as well, threatened moral and social order. Public outrage focused on the lower class streetwalkers who plied their trade visibly, rather than anything that went on behind closed doors in perhaps the more upper class scenarios. And bear in mind that only a few centuries ago, courtesans had held an awful lot of power in the upper classes for their sex, but that was considered acceptable because of the way things were conducted with the upper class. It was the lower class women that were denigrated here. So they were a small proportion of the Victorian sex industry, but because they were so visible, they were regarded as the most offensive. And as a result, it was they that were most frequently targeted by the law. Okay, so a little bit about the law. Okay, so the law in the early 19th century was mainly concerned with maintaining public order rather than anything else. And the first three major pieces of legislation that you can see on this slide here, they punished common prostitutes for behaving indecently in public or for loitering or soliciting, but not, as I say, for the act of prostitution itself. By 1869, though, the focus was changing, sparked by a government inquiry into Britain's military failures in the Crimean War. And this found that about 20% of the UK's entire military force spent around 22 days in hospital every year with some form of VD. So there were calls for better regulation, and this led ultimately to the introduction of the very controversial Contagious Diseases Act, which has got nothing to do with the foot and mouth spread outbreaks that we've had more recently. Absolutely not at all. What this did, well, this act was passed in 1864. It was not debated in either the House of Lords or the Commons. It was just passed. It set up a system to regulate prostitution specifically in garrison or naval towns, and it aimed to ensure a supply of disease-free women for the military. It gave authorities the right to stop any woman that they suspected of being a prostitute and to forcibly detain her if she refused to submit to a medical examination. No similar measures, you'll be unsurprised to learn, were brought in to check the health of the men, who also might be involved with these women. And it was absolutely guaranteed to offend those campaigning for either civil liberty or moral purity, so it was kept entirely secret while it was prepared. Florence Nightingale, who you may have heard of, was one of the few who saw the draft act. And she said, "I don't believe any House of Commons will pass this bill. Any honest girls might be locked up all night by mistake because of it." This was a galvanising point, and this was actually a catalyst for the first time that women actually got together to defend the rights of other women. So it was the origins of the first women's rights movements, which, considering International Women's Day was yesterday, is quite a timely topic to be talking about today. At the same time, though, another movement was focusing on social purity, and that the prostitution itself should be entirely stopped because of the dubious morality of what they saw in the prostitute herself. So these competing viewpoints were both being debated at the time, and they got a lot of press coverage alongside other topics such as child prostitution and also the Jack the Ripper murders, which you'll probably be aware targeted prostitutes on the streets of London. And all of this helped to galvanise the debates and to some extent frame the way the nation perceived the issue. Later legislation brought in changes that cracked down on prostitution, and it raised the age of consent for women from the age of 13 to the age of 16. There was no age of consent for men, just out of interest. It also cracked down on brothel keepers, and that made a difference as well to how things changed later on in the century. So, in the face of all this press coverage and campaigning, what I decided to do was have a look at media coverage of prostitution in Lichfield to find out how people at the local level actually felt about it. And my main source, you'll be unsurprised to learn, was the Lichfield Mercury, which was first issued in September 1887, and it was the only Lichfield-specific paper at the time. The editions summarised things like the Lichfield police courts, providing brief outlines of the various cases that were seen, and included details of the women arrested for offences in connection with prostitution as well. Through its editorials and its correspondence columns and reports of city business, it also acts as something of a bit of a barometer for local perceptions of what's going on, etc. It is a good source, but it does have some drawbacks. So for a start, there's no guarantee that every offence that is brought to the courts will be reported on. Sometimes the police courts were left out entirely due to lack of space. There's no guarantee that every offender will be brought to court. Reports indicated that sometimes the chief superintendent of police might be let off a first-time offender with a warning. And this only came to light if they reoffended. So there might be some people who just left the area having been apprehended once. And this one's a bit of a tricky point, as prostitution wasn't illegal, only offences that disturbed the public order came to light. So offenders were almost invariably from working class backgrounds, and there's no information about prostitution at other levels of the city. And what we're talking about really are things like public drunkenness, vagrancy, that kind of thing. There is also the danger of getting distracted by some of the other interesting stories in the Mercury while you're going through the papers. So, for example, we have the excitement when lighting is installed at Trent Valley Station after a gentleman's been injured by falling off the platform in the dark. And my favourite one was the tale of the labourer who was mauled by a lion at Bingley Hall. The lion tamer managed to remove the lion by first firing a pistol loaded with blanks and then by hitting it on the nose with the handle of his whip. And the lion was reported to be dazed but unharmed, and they don't report on the condition of the labourer at all, I'm afraid, so we have no idea. Okay. Another difficulty is that it isn't always easy to tell whether someone is actually a prostitute or not, because no legal definition of a prostitute was ever agreed, and they varied so much in their habits and their activities. Basically, people were doing what they needed to do to keep themselves and their families. There's examples of part-time prostitutes who were known sometimes as dollymops, and they were women usually in low-paid jobs in the service industry, and they used the sex trade to supplement their income. Interviews from the time show that prostitution was often easier or better than some of the extreme drudgery of the so-called honest trade, and in some ways it was even safer. For example, one of the most frequently recorded causes of deaths in Victorian times was scullery maids and washerwomen who were scalded to death after falling into the giant vats of boiling water. Not a nice way to go. So we do have to take the word of the newspapers or the police officer as to whether or not a woman was engaged in prostitution, and people did get it wrong. So again, during the Contagious Diseases Act, there was a notorious inspector of the Devonport district, and he became notorious for his belief that every woman was a potential whore. So he arrested any girls who stopped to talk to men or were out walking with a boyfriend. And one record details that he detained a woman under suspicion of being a prostitute because she wasn't wearing gloves. So woe betide any of us tonight if we go out. So in Lichfield, as I say, arrests and reports were always for related offences that disturbed the public order, specifically things like drunkenness, theft, vagrancy, and indecency. So, what's going on in Lichfield? Why Lichfield? We said earlier, prostitution was well established in the city in the Middle Ages, but what made it an interesting choice in this late Victorian era? Partly because of the national debate on the Contagious Diseases Act, which you'll remember I said was only relevant to specific garrison or military spaces. And it was brought in to curb the spread of VD and the armed forces in those places where military bases were established. Now, Lichfield wasn't one of those specific areas, but at the time of this study, Whittington Barracks was just being built, and it was around the time that these debates were taking place. And that meant more soldiers obviously moving into the area, which could have an impact. It also became easier to reach Lichfield in that time because the railway line to Birmingham was extended and the train station was remodelled. And at that point, women could travel more easily into the city from other locations. Lichfield residents would have been aware of what else was going on nationally, including the changes to the laws around prostitution and the coverage of the Ripper murders, etc. And there was a piece of journalistic sensationalism titled The Maiden Tribute of Modern Babylon, which was about young girls being sold into prostitution. That got massive press coverage, was largely found to be made up later on, but that doesn't matter, obviously. If it's in the papers, people read it, and that's what you get. Nationally, public opinion was changing from sympathetic movements that had campaigned against the Contagious Diseases Act to this movement for more social purity. And the local newspaper, as I say, as a barometer, could reflect local views on these national events. And there were changes to the police force in that time too, in that Lichfield merged with the Staffordshire force, and the police chief superintendent Herneman, who'd been a veteran of Lichfield for 20 years, retired. So that deprived the area of a lot of local knowledge and expertise as well. So Lichfield did look like it might be a good place to see how the impact of the changing national picture affected things more locally. So Lichfield in 1835, it's a bit of a grainy map, I'm afraid, but you can probably see here, Lichfield isn't very big in 1835. This is before the study period. It is a small city. It's lost some of its earlier status. It had been religiously significant in the past. It had been an important centre for travelling coaches, and it was the first place in Staffordshire to be granted a market charter. By the 18th century, it was a centre for the gentry. People like Samuel Johnson, David Garrick, Anna Seward, Erasmus Darwin, all lived in the city at various points. There were public walks, there were gardens, there were streetlights, and there were no less than 80 innkeepers recorded in 1732, which was obviously a further inducement to travellers to come here. But by the 19th century, it was gaining a reputation for quiet. And in 1817, Mary Baggott of Blithfield reported that the city was now unfrequented except by its regular inhabitants. The railways affected the city's important position at the centre of a network of turnpike roads, and the last coaches stopped running in 1838. And the rail didn't arrive for another 10 years, so the city's development lagged behind other cities in this time and other towns. So, as a result, Lichfield's population fell into extremes. I just knocked the table, so I was just checking to see I hadn't taken the screen out. It's fine. Industry was focused much on market gardening, and nearly 20% of its total acreage was focused on that. So there was some brewing and light engineering work that became important later in the century, but it still trailed other areas in skilled workers. And you can see from this chart here, 14% of working age males recorded in 1881 fall into middle and upper classes, which are represented as professionals and managers. but nearly 37% fall into the lowest classes of worker, which include semi-skilled and unskilled manual workers, domestic servants, and farm labourers. And that's higher than Walsall and Wolverhampton, which are both larger and more industrialised and have higher proportions of workers in the middle class, class 3, which included the skilled manual workers. The 1881 census shows that in Lichfield, the low-skilled, low-paced service industry was the biggest employment sector, with agriculture and mining the next largest occupations. So I just wanted to give you a brief flavour of Lichfield inns and public houses, because obviously they do feature quite heavily in reports of public prostitution. So here's the list of inns and pubs in 1830, bearing in mind the small size of the city. You can see quite a lot there, really, given the population size. So by 1882, the map has changed. The railways have now arrived. You can see a long line there, and you may be able to see, but the Trent Valley Brewery has arrived near the Trent Valley Junction as well. Now, Lichfield's population grew much slower than other more industrialised towns locally. Between 1801 and 1901, the population grew by just under half, peaking at about 1851 and then tapering off. And 2 foundries and a brewery closed in that time as well, so less, again, chance for people to have occupations. Lichfield's small size might have helped to keep crime low, because it's more difficult to go undetected in a small city compared to bigger places that could offer anonymity, to criminals, prostitutes and customers. In 1877, the Lichfield Mercury recorded that there were then 66 public houses and 8 beer houses in the city. And in 1833, the city was described as orderly as well as quiet. Now, I mentioned as well there were changes to the police force during this period. From around 1870 until he retired in April 1893, the police force were led by Superintendent Hurneman, I mentioned earlier. But during his tenure, the force were taken over again by the Staffordshire force, at which point 2 of the longest-serving police constables retired, and Hurneman followed them himself only a couple of years later. So that loss of experience could have affected arrest rates and the ability to identify transgressors. But the city was very proud of its low crime rate, and at quarter sessions, when there weren't any prisoners, a pair of white kid gloves was presented to the mayor as a symbol of the city's purity. In 1881, the outgoing mayor was recorded vehemently defending the reputation of the city, stating that there was not a streetwalker in Lichfield, and only 2 or 3 years ago, there was not a public woman in the town. But the building of the new military barracks in the city outskirts was bound to affect things. Whittington Barracks was completed in 1881 on the former racecourse at Whittington Heath. And Lichfield did see this as a positive thing. The Lichfield Mercury reported that it could increase trade and also increase the city's importance. So Lichfield was keen to regain its status after its previous years of strategic importance. But the authorities knew that soldiers can mean trouble as well. Although Lichfield was not subject to the Contagious Diseases Act, the new barracks contained a large quantity of men billeted close together, and so was considered likely to cause problems for the city. And this then was the city during the period covered by my study. Small, quiet, to some extent forgotten by progress, but eager to regain some of the status it had in earlier years, and about to be onset by a bunch of soldiers. So, were things about to change? Okay, so what we have here is a graph that shows the number of reports in the Mercury linked to prostitution between 1877 and 1896. September 1877 to the end of 1882, there were 10 incidents that seemed linked with prostitution. 8 of those 10 relate to one person, a lady called Sarah Thacker, who is the most prolific offender. She has here 2 assaults, 5 counts of drunkenness, and mentioned as a witness up to 1882. And we will come back to Sarah later because I liked her. She was very interesting. 2 other reports of women charged with drunkenness and conduct most disgraceful, whatever that may mean, and a young woman of loose character charged with loitering. All of these women lived in Lichfield at the time. And then, as you see, we get to 1883, and there's quite a big increase all of a sudden. So what could possibly have changed at that point? Well, according to the Mercury, in the summer of 1883, the North and South Staffordshire regiments of militia were camped on Whittington Heath. The Stoke-on-Trent and other volunteers were undergoing training locally, and the Queen's Own Royal Yeomanry assembled in Lichfield for their annual week's drill. The city also hosted 4 festivals that year, including the Lichfield Bower. So what was happening here was this was providing a reason for women to visit the city. The 20 reports in that year alone involved 14 different women. At least 8 of those weren't local. It's likely that the arrival of the soldiers was responsible for the increase. And this was borne out in other areas as well. So, for example, in 1860, Clonmel Island reported a huge increase in prostitutes when the town became headquarters to a military garrison. And a witness to the Poor Law Inquiry of 1830 noted that prostitutes follow the barracks while they're good looking. So, 8 of the reports in that year specifically mentioned women with soldiers. Chief Superintendent Herneman reported a number of complaints about the behaviour of soldier and prostitutes. Sarah Thacker was linked to 4 more incidents. 1883 was also the first time the Mercury actually called any woman a prostitute, and it named 6 of 14 women as prostitutes during that year. So again, bearing in mind the difficulty defining that, they obviously made a judgment what was going on there. It also recorded a brothel, a house on Grange Lane, belonging to the church commissioners. Inspectors found this house occupied by at least 5 prostitutes, some not over 14. And as I mentioned earlier, in this year, the age of consent for girls was just 13, so they were actually of age. So, nationally, in April 1883, the Contagious Diseases Act was repealed after a long fight. This didn't seem to have any concern to Lichfield whatsoever, despite any of the press coverages. And most of the time, if the Mercury did refer to the Contagious Diseases Act, it was referring to the acts relevant to the movement of livestock, with foot and mouth disease the main concern, as we've seen more recently.